Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt Kramer here, and I am going to read because I missed two Fridays um, for Federalist Friday. I'm actually going to read two Federalist papers, number 42 and number 43. They're fairly short, and both, I believe, are written by Mr. James Madison. So here we go, number 42. The second class of powers lodged in the general government consists of those which regulate the intercourse with foreign nations, to wit, to make treaties, to send and receive ambassadors, other public ministers, and councils, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations, to regulate foreign commerce, including the power to prohibit, after the year 1808, the importation of slaves, and to lay an intermediate duty of $10 per head as a discouragement to such importations. This class of powers forms an obvious and essential branch of the federal administration. If we are to be one nation in any respect, it clearly ought to be in respect to other nations. The powers to make treaties and to send and receive ambassadors speak their own propriety. Both of them are comprised in the Articles of Confederation, with this difference only, that the former is disembarrassed by the plan of the convention, of an exception under which treaties might be substantially frustrated by regulations of the states, and that the power of appointing and receiving other public ministers and councils is expressly and very properly added to the former provision concerning ambassadors. The term ambassador, if taken strictly, as seems to be required by the second of the Articles of Confederation, comprehends the highest grade only of public ministers and excludes the grades which the United States will be most likely to prefer, where foreign embassies may be necessary. And under no latitude of construction will the term comprehend consuls. Yet it has been found expedient and has been the practice of Congress to employ the inferior grades of public ministers and to send and receive consuls. It is true that where treaties of commerce stipulate for the mutual appointment of consuls, whose functions are connected with commerce, the admission of foreign consuls may fall within the power of making commercial treaties, and that where no such treaties exist, the mission of American consuls into foreign countries may perhaps be covered under the authority given by the 9th Article of the Confederation, to appoint all such civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs of the United States. But the admission of consuls into the United States, where no previous treaty has stipulated it, seems to have been nowhere provided for. A supply of the omission is one of the lesser instances in which the convention have improved on the model before them. But the most minute provisions become important when they tend to obviate this necessity or the pretext for gradual and unobserved usurpations of power. A list of the cases in which Congress have been portrayed or forced to by the defects of the Confederation into violations of their chartered authorities would not a little surprise those who have paid no attention to the subject, and would be no inconsiderable argument in favor of the new constitution, which seems to have provided no less studiously for the lesser than the more obvious and striking defects of the old. The power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations belongs with equal propriety to the general government, and is a still greater improvement on the Articles of Confederation. These articles contain no provision for the case of offenses against the law of nations, and consequently leave it in the power of any indiscreet member to embroil the Confederacy with foreign nations. The provision of the federal articles on the subject of piracies and felonies extends no further than to the establishment of courts for the trial of those offenses. The definition of piracies might perhaps without inconveniency be left to the law of nations, though a legislative definition of them is found in most municipal codes. A definition of felonies on the high seas is evidently requisite. Felony is a term of loose signification, even in the common law of England, and of various importance in the statute law of that kingdom. But neither the common nor the statute law of that or any other nation ought to be a standard for the proceedings of this, unless previously made its own by legislative adoption. The meaning of the term as defined in the codes of the several states would be as impracticable as a former would be a dishonorable and illegitimate guide. It is not precisely the same in any two states and varies in each with every nation of its criminal laws. For the sake of certainty and uniformity, therefore, the power of defining felonies in this case was in every respect necessary and proper. The regulation of foreign commerce having fallen within several views of which have been taken of this subject have been too fully discussed to need additional proofs here of its being properly submitted to the federal administration. If there doubtless to be wished that the power of prohibiting the importation of slaves had not been postponed until the year 1808, or rather that it had been suffered to have immediate operation. But it is not difficult to account either for this restriction on the general government or for the manner in which the whole clause is expressed. It ought to be considered as a great point gained in favor of humanity that a period of 20 years may terminate forever within these states a traffic which has so long and so loudly upbraided the barbarism of modern policy, that within that period it will receive a considerable discouragement from the federal government and may be totally abolished by concurrence of the few states which continue to the unnatural traffic in the prohibitory example, which has been given by so great a majority of the Union. Happy would it be for the unfortunate Africans if an equal prospect lay before them of being redeemed from the oppression of their European brethren. Attempts have been made to pervert this clause into an objection against the Constitution by representing it on one side as a criminal toleration of an illicit practice, and on another as calculated to prevent voluntary and beneficial emigrations from America to Europe. From Europe to America. James Madison, mentioned these misconstructions not with a view to give them an answer, for they deserve none, but as specimens of the manner and spirit in which some have thought fit to conduct their opposition to the proposed government. The powers included in the third class are those which provide for the harmony and proper intercourse among the states. Under this head might be included the particular restraints imposed on the authority of the states and certain powers of the judicial department. For the former are reserved for the distinct class, and the latter will be particularly examined when we arrive at the structure and organization of the government. I shall confine myself to a cursory review of the remaining powers comprehended under this third description, to wit, to regulate commerce among several states and the Indian tribes, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and the foreign coin, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the current coin and securities of the United States, to fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws of bankruptcy, to prescribe the manner in which the public acts records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be proved, and the effect they shall have in other states, and to establish post offices and post roads. Excuse me. The defect of power in the existing confederacy to regulate the commerce between its several members and then is the number of those which have been clearly pointed out by experience. To the proofs and remarks which former papers have brought into view on the subject, it may be added that without the supplemental provision, the great and essential power of regulating foreign commerce would have been incomplete and ineffectual. A very material object of this power was the relief of the United States of the states which import and export through other states from the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Were these at liberty to regulate the trade between state and state, it must be foreseen that ways would be found out to load the articles of import and export during the passage through their jurisdiction with duties which would fall on the makers of the latter and the consumers of the former. We may be assured by past experience that such a practice would be introduced by future contrivances, and both by that and a common knowledge of human affairs, that it would nourish nourish unceasing animosities and not improperly terminate in serious interruptions of the public tranquility. To those who do not view the question through the medium of passion or of interest, the desire of the commercial states to collect in any form an indirect revenue from their uncommercial neighbors must appear not less impolitic than it is unfair, since it would stimulate the injured party by resentment as well as interest to resort to less convenient channels of their foreign trade. But the mild voice of reason pleading the cause of an enlarged and permanent interest is but too often drowned before public bodies as well as individuals by the clamors of an impatient avidity for immediate and immoderate gain. The necessity of a superintending authority over the reciprocal trade of confederated states has been illustrated by other examples as well as our own. In Switzerland, where the union is so very slight, each canton is obliged to allow to merchandises a passage that through its jurisdiction into other cantons, without an augmentation of the tolls. In Germany, it is a law of the empire that the princes and states shall not lay tolls or customs on bridges, rivers, or passages without the consent of the emperor and the diet. Though it appears from a quotation in an antecedent paper that the practice within this, as in many other instances in the Confederacy, had not followed the law and has produced there the mischiefs which have been foreseen here. Among the restraints imposed by the Union of the Netherlands on its members, one is that they shall not establish imposts disadvantageous to the neighbors without the general permission. The regulation of commerce with the Indian tribes and are very properly unfettered from two limitations in the Articles of Confederation, which render the provision obscure and contradictory. Regulation of commerce with the Indian is very proper. Okay. The power is there restrained to Indians, not members of any of the states, and is not to violate or infringe the legislative right of any state within its own limits. What description of Indians are to be deemed members of a state is not yet settled, and has been a question of frequent perplexity and contention in the federal councils. And how the trade with Indians, though not members of a state, yet residing within its legislative jurisdiction, can be regulated by an external authority, without so far intruding on the internal rights of legislation, is absolutely incomprehensible. This is not the only case in which the Articles of Confederation have inconsiderable inconsiderately endeavor to accomplish impossibilities, to reconcile a partial sovereignty in a union with complete sovereignty in the states, to subvert a mathematical axiom by taking away a part and letting the whole remain. All that need be remarked on the power of coin money, regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, is that by providing for this last case, the Constitution has supplied a material omission in the Articles of Confederation. The authority of the existing Congress is restrained to the regulation of coin struck by their own authority or that of the respective states. It must be seen at once that the proposed uniformity in the value of the current coin might be destroyed by subjecting that of foreign coin to the different regulations of the different states. The punishment of counterfeiting the public in securities as well as the current coin is submitted, of course, to that authority, which is to secure the value of both. The regulation of weights and measures is transferred from the Article of Confederation and is founded on the considerations with the the regulation of weights and measures is transferred from the Articles of Confederation and is founded on like considerations with the preceding power of regulating coin. The dissimilarity in the rules of naturalization has long been remarked as a fault in our system and as laying a foundation for intricate and delicate questions. In the fourth article of the Confederation, it is declared that the free inhabitants of each of the states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states, and that the people of each state shall in every other enjoy all the privileges of trade and commerce, etc. There is a confusion of language here, which is remarkable. Why the terms free inhabitants are used in one part of the article, free citizens in another, and people in another? Or what was meant by superadding to all privileges and immunities of free citizens? All the privileges of trade and commerce cannot easily be determined. It seems to be a construction scarcely avoidable, however, that those who come under the denomination of free inhabitants of a state, although not citizens of such state, are entitled in every other state to all the privileges of free citizens of the latter. That is, to greater privileges than they may be entitled to in their own state, so that it may be in the power of a particular state, or rather every state is laid under necessity not only to confer the rights of citizenship in other states upon any whom it may admit to such rights within itself, but upon any whom it may allow to become inhabitants within its jurisdiction. But were an exposition of the term inhabitants to be admitted, which would confine the stipulated privileges to citizens alone, the difficulty is diminished only, not removed. The very improper power would still be retained by each state of naturalizing aliens in every other state. In one state, residence for short term confirms all the rights of citizenship. In another, qualifications of greater importance are required. An alien, therefore, legally incapacitated for certain rights in the latter, may, by previous residence only in the former, elude his incapacity. And thus the law of one state be preposterously rendered paramount to the law of another, within the jurisdiction of the other. We owe it to a mere casualty that very serious embarrassments on this subject have been hitherto escaped. By the laws of several states, certain descriptions of aliens who had rendered themselves obnoxious were laid under interdicts, inconsistent not only with the rights of citizenship, but with the privilege of residence. What would have been the consequences if such persons, by residence or otherwise, had acquired the character of citizens under the laws of another state? and then asserted their rights as such, both to residence and citizenship within the state prescribing them. Whatever the legal consequences may have been, the other consequences would probably have resulted of too serious a nature not to be provided against. The new Constitution has accordingly, with great propriety, made provision against them and all others proceeding from the defect of the Confederation on this head, by authorizing the general government to establish a uniform rule of naturalization throughout the United States. The power of establishing uniform laws of bankruptcy is so intimately connected with the regulation of commerce and will prevent so many frauds where the parties or their property may lie or be removed into different states, that the expediency of it seems not likely to be drawn into question. The power of prescribing by general laws the manner in which the public acts records, records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be proved, and the effect they shall have in other states is an evident and valuable improvement on the clause relating to this subject in the Articles of Confederation. The meaning of the latter is extremely indeterminate and can be of little importance under any interpretation which it will bear. The power here established by the power here established may be rendered a very convenient instrument of justice and be particularly beneficial on the burdens of contiguous states, where the effects liable to justice may be suddenly and secretly translated in any stage of the process within the foreign jurisdiction. The power of establishing post roads must, in every view, be a harmless power and may perhaps by judicious veniency. Nothing which tends to facilitate the intercourse between the state can be deemed states can be deemed unworthy of the public care. Okay, nothing which tends to facilitate the intercourse between the states can be deemed unworthy of the public care. Okay. Number 43. The fourth class comprises the following miscellaneous powers. 1. A power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to the respective writings and discoveries. The utility of this power will scarcely be questioned. The copyright of authors has been solemnly adjudged in Great Britain to be a right of common law. The right to useful invention seems with equal reason to belong to the inventors. The public good fully coincides in both cases with the claims of individuals. The states cannot separately make effectual provision for either of the cases, and most of them have anticipated the decision of this point by laws passed by the instance of Congress. 2. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by session of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority all over places purchased by the consent of the legislatures of the states, in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. The indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, I might say of the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Okay. power exercised by every, but he wants it. But Madison says the world by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, only the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity. But a dependence of the members of the general government on the state, comprehending the seat of the government for protection and the exercise of their duty. Exercise of their duty might bring on the national councils of imputation of awe or influence, equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. This consideration has the more weight as a gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state, and would create so many obstacles to a removal of the government as still further to abridge its necessary independence. The extent of the federal districts. Where was I? Consideration has the more weight of the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state, and would create so many obstacles to removal of the government as still further to abridge its necessary independence. The extent of this federal district is sufficiently circumscribed to satisfy every jealousy of an opposite nature, and as it is to be appropriated to this use with the consent of the state seating it, as the state will no doubt provide in the compact for the rights and consent of the citizens inhabiting it, as the inhabitants will find sufficient inducements of interest to become willing parties to the cession. The cession spelled Cession. Cession or cession, I'm not sure. As they will have had their voice in the election of the government, which is to exercise authority over them as a municipal legislature for local purposes, derived from their own suffrages, will of course be allowed them, and as authority of the legislature of the state and of the inhabitants of the ceded part of it to concur in the cession will be derived from the whole people of the state in their adoption of the Constitution. Every imaginable objection seems to be obviated. The necessity of a like authority over forts, magazines, etc., established by the general government is not less evident. The public money expended on such places and the public property deposited in them required that they should be exempt from the authority of the particular state, nor would it be proper for the places on which the security of the entire union depend to be in any degree dependent on a particular member of it. All objections and scruples are here also obviated by the requiring the concurrence of the states concerned in every such establishment. Number 3, to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture, except during the life of the person attainted. As treason may be committed against the United States, and the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it. But as newfangled and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent affections, the natural offspring of free government, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other, the convention have, with great judgment, opposed a barrier to this peculiar danger by inserting a constitutional definition of the crime, fixing the proof of necessary for conviction of it, and restraining the Congress, even in punishing it, from extending the consequences. Restraining the Congress, even in punishing it, from extending the consequences of guilt beyond the person of its author. Number 4, to admit new states into the Union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, or any state may be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. In the Articles of Confederation, no provision is found on this important subject. Canada was to be admitted. In the Articles of Confederation, Canada was to be admitted of right on the joining in the measures of the United States and by other colonies, by which were evidently meant the other British colonies at the discretion of 9 states. The eventual establishment of new states seems to have been overlooked by the compilers of that instrument. We have seen the inconveniences of this omission and the assumption of power into which Congress have been led by it. With great propriety, therefore, has the new system supplied the defect. The general precautions that no new states shall be formed without the concurrence of the federal authority and of the states concerned is consonant to the principles which ought to govern such transactions. The particular precaution against the erection of new states by the portion consonant to the principles which ought to govern such transactions. The particular precaution against the erection of new states by the partition of a state with its consent quiets the jealousy of the larger states, as that of the smaller is quieted by the like precaution against the junction states without the consent. Number 5, to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory of other property belonging to the United States, with a proviso that nothing in the Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States over any particular state. This is a power of great importance and required for consideration similar to those which show the propriety of the former. The proviso annexed is proper in itself and was probably rendered absolutely necessary by jealousies and the questions concerning the Western Territory sufficiently known to the public. Number 6, the guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government to protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. In the Confederacy founded on Republican principles and composed of Republican members, the superintending government ought clearly to possess authority to defend the system against aristocratic and monarchical innovations. The more intimate the nature of such a union may be, the greater interest have the members in the political institutions of each other, and the greater right to insist that the forms of government under which the compact is entered into should be substantially maintained. But a right implies a remedy. And where else would the remedy be deposited than where it is deposited by the Constitution? Governments of dissimilar principles and forms have been found less adapted to a federal coalition of any sort than those of a kindred nature. As the Confederate Republic of Germany, says Montesquieu, consists of free cities and petty states subject to different principles, experience shows us it is more important than that of the United As a Confederate Republic of Germany, says Montesquieu, consists of free cities and petty states, subject to different princes. Experience shows us that it is more imperfect than that of Holland and Switzerland. Greece was undone, he adds, as soon as the king of Macedon obtained a seat among the Amphictyons. I think I said that right. In the latter case, no doubt the disproportionate force, as well as a monarchical form of the new confederate, had its share of influence on the events, and may possibly be asked what need there could be of such a precaution, and whether it may not become a pretext of the alterations. Alterations. Gosh, I'm falling asleep here. In the latter case, no doubt the disproportionate force, as well as a monarchical form of the new confederate, had its share of the influence on the events. It may possibly be asked what need there could be of such a precaution, and whether it may not become a pretext of alterations in state governments, without the concurrence of the states themselves. These questions admit of ready answers. If the interposition of the general government should not be needed, the provision for such an event will be a harmless superfluity. That's a hard word. Only in the Constitution. But who can say that what experiments may be produced by the caprice of particular states, by the ambition of enterprising leaders, or by the intrigues and influence of foreign powers? To the second question, it may be answered that if the general government should interpose by virtue of this constitutional authority, it will be, of course, bound to pursue the authority. But the authority extends no further than the guarantee of a republican form of government, which supposes a pre-existing government of the form which is to be guaranteed. As long, therefore, as the existing republican forms are continued by the states, are guaranteed by the federal constitution. Whenever the states may choose to substitute other republican forms, they have a right to do so and to claim the federal guarantee for the latter. The only restriction imposed on them is that they shall not exchange republican or anti-republican constitutions. A restriction which is presumed will hardly be considered as a grievance. A protection against invasion is due from every society to the parts composing it. The latitude of the expression here used seems to secure each state not only against foreign hostility, but against ambitious or vindictive enterprises or its more powerful neighbors. A few more pages. The history, both of ancient and modern confederacies, proves that the weaker members of the Union ought not to be insensible to the policy of this article. Protection against domestic violence is added with equal propriety. It has been remarked, that even among the Swiss cantons, which properly speaking are not under one government, provision is made for this object. And the history of that league informs us that mutual aid is frequently claimed and afforded, and as well by the most democratic as the other cantons. A recent and well-known event among ourselves has warned us to be prepared for emergencies of a like nature. At first view, it may seem not to square with the Republican theory to suppose either that a majority have not the right or that a minority will have the force to subvert a government, and consequently that the federal interposition can never be required, but when it would be improper. Can never be required, but when it would be improper, only when it is improper. But theoretic reasoning in this, as in most other cases, must be qualified by the lessons of practice, which may not elicit combinations for purposes of violence, be formed as well by a majority of a state, especially a small state. as by the majority of county or district of the same state, or of the authority of the state ought, in the latter case, to protect the local magistracy ought not the federal government in the former to support the state authority. Okay, let me try that again. Why may not illicit combinations for purposes of violence be formed as well by a majority of a state, especially a small state, as by a majority of a county or a district of the same state? And if the authority of the state ought, in the latter case, to protect the local magistracy, that's a hard word, ought not the federal government in the former to support the state authority. Besides, there are certain parts of the state constitutions which are so interwoven within the federal why is constitution such a hard word? That a violent blow cannot be given to the one without communicating the wound to the other. Insurrection in the state will rarely induce a federal interposition unless the number concerned in them bears some proportion to the friends of government. It will be much better than that the violence in such cases should be repressed by the superintending power than that the majority should be left to maintain their cause by bloody and obstinate contest. The existence of a right to interpose would generally prevent this necessity of exerting it. Is it true that force and right are necessarily on the same side in Republican governments? May not the minor party possess such a superiority of pecuniary resources of military talents and experience, or secret succors from foreign powers, as would render it superior also in the appeal of the sword? May not a more compact and advantageous position turn the scale on the same side against a superior number, so situated as to be less capable of a prompt and collected exertion of its strength? Nothing can be more chimerical than to imagine that in the trial of actual force, victory may be calculated by the rules which prevail in the senses of the inhabitants, or which determine the event of an election. May it not happen, in fine, the minority of citizens may become a majority of persons by the accession of alien residents, of a casual concourse of adventurers, or of those whom the constitution of the state has not admitted to the rights of suffrage. I take no notice of an unhappy species of population abounding in some of the states who, during the calm of regular government, are sunk below the level of men, but who, in the tempestuous scenes of civil violence, may emerge into the human character and give a superiority of strength to any party with which they may associate themselves. In cases where it may be doubtful on which side justice lies, what better umpires could be desired by two violent factions flying to arms and tearing the state to pieces than the representatives of Confederate states not heated by the local flame? To the impartiality of justice, they would unite the affection of friends. Happy would it be if such a remedy for its infirmities could be enjoyed by all free governments, if a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of mankind. Should it be asked what is to be the redress in an insurrection pervading all the states and compromising the superiority of the entire force, though not a constitutional right, the answer must be that such a case, as it would be without the compass of human remedies, so it is fortunately not within the compass of human probability, and that it is a sufficient recommendation of the federal constitution that it diminishes the risk of a calamity for which no possible constitution can provide a cure. Among the advantages of a Confederate republic enumerated by Montesquieu, an important one is that should a popular insurrection happen in one of the states, the others are able to quell it. Should abuses creep into one part, they are reformed by those that remain sound. They're still counting. Number 7, to consider all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution as being no less valid against the United States under this Constitution than under the Confederation. This can only be considered by a declaratory proposition and may have been inserted, among other reasons, for the satisfaction of the foreign creditors of the United States, who cannot be strangers to the pretended doctrine that a change in the political form of civil society has the magical effect of dissolving its moral obligations. Among the lesser criticisms which have been exercised on the Constitution, it has been remarked that the validity of engagements ought to have been asserted in favor of the United States as well as against them, and in the spirit which usually characterizes little critics. The omission has been transformed and magnified into a plot against the United national rights. The authors of this discovery may be told that what few others need to be informed of, that as engagements are in their nature reciprocal, an assertion of their validity on one side necessarily involves a validity on the other side, and that as the articles are merely declaratory, the establishment of the principle in one case is sufficient for every case. They may be further told that every constitution must limit its precautions to dangers that are not altogether imaginary, and that no real danger can exist that the government would dare, with or without this constitutional declaration before it, to remit the debts justly due to the public and on a pretext here condemned. Number 8, to provide for amendments to be ratified by 3/4 of the states under 2 exceptions only. That useful alterations will be suggested by experience cannot but be foreseen. It was requisite, therefore, that a mode for introducing them should be provided. The mode preferred by the convention seems to be stamped with every mark of propriety. It guards equally against the extreme facility which will render the Constitution too mutable, and that extreme difficulty which might perpetuate in discovered faults. It moreover equally enables the general and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors, as they may be pointed out by the experience on one side or on the other. The exception in favor of the equality of suffrage in the Senate was probably meant as a palladium to the residuary sovereignty of the states, implied and secured by that principle of representation in one branch of the legislature, and was probably insisted on by the states particularly attached to that equality. The other exception must have been emitted on the same considerations which produce the privileges defended by it. Number 9, the ratification of the conventions of 9 states should be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states ratifying the same. This article speaks for itself. The express authority of the people alone could give due validity to the Constitution. To have required the unanimous ratification of the 13 states would have subjected the essential interests of the whole to the caprice or corruption of a single member. It would have marked a want of foresight in the convention which our own experience would have rendered inexcusable. 2 questions of a very delicate nature present themselves on this occasion. Number 1, on what principle the Confederation, which stand in the solemn form of a compact among the states, can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it? And number 2, what relation is to subsist between the 9 or more states ratifying the Constitution and the remaining few who does not become parties of it? The first question is answered at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects of which all political institutions aim, and to which all such institutions must be sacrificed. Perhaps also an answer may be found without searching beyond the principles of the compact itself. It has been heretofore noted among the defects of the Confederation that in many of the states it had received no higher sanction than a mere legislative ratification. The principle of reciprocality seems to require that its obligation on the other states should be reduced to the same standard. A compact between independent sovereigns founded on ordinary acts of legislative authority can pretend to no higher validity than a league or treaty between the parties. It is an established doctrine on the subject of treaties that all the articles are mutually conditions of each other, that a breach of any one article is a breach on a whole treaty, and that a breach committed by either the parties absolves the others and authorizes them, if they please, to pronounce a compact violated and void. Should it unhappily be necessary to appeal to these delicate truths for the justification of dispensing with the consent of particular states to dissolution of the federal pact, will not the complaining parties find it a difficult task to answer the multiplied and important infractions with which they may be confronted? The time has been when it was incumbent on us all to veil the ideas which this paragraph exhibits. The scene is now changed, and with it the part which the same motives dictate. The second question is not less delicate, and the flattening prospect of it is being flattering prospect of its being merely hypothetical forbids an over-curious discussion of it. It's one of those cases which must be left to provide for itself. In general, it must be observed that although no political relation can subsist between assenting and dissenting states, yet the moral relations will remain uncancelled. The claims of justice by both on one side and on the other will be enforced and must be fulfilled. The rights of humanity must in all cases be duly and mutually respected, whilst considerations of common interest, and above all the remembrance of the enduring scenes which are past, and the anticipation of it. Remembrance of the enduring scenes which are past, and the anticipation of a speedy triumph over the obstacles of reunion will, it is hoped, not urge in vain moderation on one side and prudence on the other. Whew. So it's a lot of reading. Okay, so we did 2 articles to make up for the 2 Fridays I missed. So next video we will go to Star Trek Fleet Command, and then we would probably do some more readings if I have time. So stay tuned.